The latest document dump of convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein's emails has given us plenty of examples to show you in terms of media bias. Now, while some examples are more subtle, others are pretty easily spotted attempts to sway a narrative to fit one agenda or another. Political opinions are pretty strong over Epstein and how the government is handling the case. As you're about to see, there's a way to frame the facts of this story that's beneficial for both the political left and the political right. Today, we're going to show you just how left and right-leaning media outlets do it. We'll be bringing in another guest in this week's episode to help us further peel back the media's flaws in coverage. Welcome back to Bias Breakdown. Here's the latest stir-up in a nutshell. House Democrats released 3 screenshots of email correspondence between Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and writer Michael Wolff. Hours later, the Republican-led House Oversight Committee released another 20,000 pages of Epstein documents. These are the files that created a flurry of headlines, with left and right-leaning media reporting the facts in totally contrasting ways, a duel over control of the narrative. Here are some examples. A left-leaning headline from Al Jazeera highlighted this quote from one of the emails released first by House Democrats, an email that alleged Trump spent hours with victim at Epstein's house. But a right-leaning headline from the New York Post highlighted the White House's response to that released email, revealing the redacted victim was Virginia Giuffre, someone who always said Trump never did anything wrong. It's the same sentence from an email, same story, but framed in 2 different ways. It fit a broader trend among news outlets and the perspectives highlighted in headlines by each partisan side. Take these headlines from left-leaning outlets. These are examples of outlets emphasizing quotes from the emails and Epstein, tying the sex offender to Trump. But then take these headlines from right-leaning news organizations. These are examples of outlets emphasizing quotes from the White House and Trump, minimizing the emails or ties to Epstein. We're bringing media watchdog group All Sides back into our conversation this week to further talk about this media divide in story framing of Epstein. We sent over several stories, and together with All Sides editor-in-chief Henry A. Brechter, we broke down different types of biases in the media's reporting, starting with how some outlets are slanting and spinning the story.
There's a ton of different types of bias at play here. Narratives are being slanted to favor one side or the other. That's what you see when a particular piece of content is just focused on quotes from Trump or just focused on quotes from the emails from Epstein and then interpretations of those emails from people who might be on the left, Democrats or otherwise. So that definitely examples of both slant and spin, the sort of manipulation and framing of a narrative in such a way that it puts down the other side of the argument.
It wasn't just headlines that would read in contrast of one another, but take coverage from MSNBC on the left and the Daily Wire on the right. The headlines read similarly to each other, highlighting another portion of an Epstein email that alleged Trump knew about the girls. But the story is told very differently within the articles. MSNBC started the story with multiple Epstein email quotes, then summed up the email correspondence as evidence that undercuts the president's attempts to distance himself from Epstein. The White House's response is in the last paragraph, whereas take the Daily Wire's report and the White House's response is in the first paragraph, calling it a fake narrative and smear. Their last paragraph starts with Trump not being accused of any wrongdoing. So it was the same story, nearly identical headlines, but these outlets favored one political perspective over the other, evident in how they prioritize certain quotes and voices, which is another form of media bias by viewpoint placement.
It's one thing to just not cover a point of view at all. That's what we call bias by omission, if that's just straight up left out of the content altogether. Bias by viewpoint placement is a little bit harder to detect sometimes because that might occur when an article or a podcast or any piece of content, it does include the different perspectives, but it organizes or addresses them in an imbalanced way.
It's not just perspectives or interpretation of the facts that read differently among left and right news outlets, but the facts themselves can be construed. There is a discharge petition in the House that just received enough votes to force House Speaker Mike Johnson to call for the vote on the Epstein files release. Out of 217 signatures, only these 4 Republicans put their name on that petition to call for a vote. There were reports circulating that President Trump spoke with Boebert and Nancy Mace regarding their signatures on the petition. It was framed by left-leaning Axios as Trump pressuring Lauren Boebert and Nancy Mace. But right-leaning Washington Examiner reported there was no pressure put on the congresswoman who spoke with Trump about the Epstein files.
When the headlines are in such direct opposition from different sides of the media on a story like this, it shows that outlets are, unfortunately, a lot of news outlets and journalists are more focused on appeasing and appealing to their base rather than appealing to a diverse audience.
2 more quick examples for you of how media framing matters, then the political analysis behind why these partisan patterns in Epstein coverage persist. First, Politico on the left, a headline that reads, "Latest Epstein files knock White House on its heels."
Right away, that headline is framing the White House as being on the defense, as being unstable and unsteady.
The Politico writer describes the emails as the latest blow to a White House already reeling.
Subjective qualifying adjectives like that are something that we see used a lot.
And Politico writes the email revelation followed a brutal week for President Donald Trump. Even though 6 paragraphs down, they quote White House officials who pushed back against their own characterization.
Politico describes Trump's week as brutal. That's a very subjective assessment. To reach for such a subjective qualification like that is a just clear-cut example of bias, something that we point out a lot.
Then there's this article from Newsmax on the right. Trump blasts Dems' Epstein email deflections.
It leads with that charged adjective, blasts, and it also uses a quote from Trump calling them deflections. And in the context of that headline, it does read like Newsmax is endorsing his point of view.
Newsmax describes Trump as coming out swinging in response to the Epstein emails.
And that sort of frames him as, on the attack and sort of fighting back against unjust criticism.
And throughout the article, only Trump and the White House are quoted.
At all sides, our position is you can't claim to understand an issue if you can't articulate the side of the issue that you disagree with. If a perspective is omitted entirely from a story, that's an egregious example of bias.
So why do we see this sort of, quite frankly, obvious divide in how the media is covering this story? There's a lot of different angles to take, but there are partisan patterns in what voices to amplify and what information to showcase. Henry has this explanation and analysis to offer as to why left and right media are choosing to cover Epstein the way that they are.
Outlets on the left know that their audience is generally going to be more likely to want to criticize Trump or find evidence that Trump did something wrong with this story. So it's natural that they would focus on the critics of Trump. The right, the exact opposite is true. They know their audience is looking for information that absolves Trump. So if they can lead with his defenses or evidence that goes against what Democrats are presenting, they're going to lead with that. And that's when you start dealing with, like I said earlier, these different truths and real extreme polarization on an issue where seemingly there's like no common solution to be had.
The media is aware of the current landscape, and left and right media often try to criticize the opposing side's coverage. NPR criticized right-wing media's coverage, describing it as shrugging off the story. Meanwhile, the Daily Wire was critical of legacy outlets, pointing to Bill O'Reilly's claim that mainstream media omitted testimony from Epstein attorney Alan Dershowitz that exonerates President Trump. Henry says this sort of storytelling in the form of finger-pointing says a lot about the current climate.
It's unfortunately illustrative of just how combative all of politics is, and now it's sort of seeped its way into the media circulation and into how people read about issues and learn about issues. And that's more of that vicious cycle of constant negativity, focused on enemies, covering that, encouraging readers to engage with that. And then readers become more and more polarized. and less open to discussions with people that they disagree with, less open to, the core functions of a healthy democracy and a healthy society.
And that's your bias breakdown. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode all the way to the end here. This is a big story with a lot of public interest, and there should be plenty of updates as the week progresses. The House voted on the Epstein files, and President Trump is now calling on his party to support the release of all files. And the DOJ will likely have to respond. Trump is also calling for several Epstein-related investigations. So it's likely this story will stay in the news cycle for weeks and maybe even months. So as you continue to follow coverage on this subject, hopefully you'll keep some of the talking points from today in mind to spot potential media bias and approach the story with a critical eye. A big thank you to Henry for taking the time to talk with us about this complex story and for helping identify the media narratives and spin. Now, if you missed last week's episode, be sure to find our podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms. There you can catch our story on Nigeria and how the media is cherry-picking data on Christian deaths. We had Julie from All Sides help us break down the coverage and explain the left and right media narratives in that story. And if you're watching me now on either Spotify or YouTube, then help me out, give us a like, and leave me a quick comment. Give me your thoughts on the media you've been consuming over this Epstein story, and if you've already noticed some of these partisan patterns in your own news consumption. Thank you to Ian Kennedy, our video editor, and Ali Caldwell on our graphics. Again, thanks to Henry for sharing your perspective with us on this week's episode, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.